Sunday morning, November 1944. A small Lutheran church in rural Nebraska. The air smells of old wood, hymnals, and wax. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass, paints colored patterns on the simple wooden pews. The congregation sings, their voices earnest, filling the small sanctuary. In the third row from the back sits a young man, barely 21 years old. He wears simple work clothes, but his posture is rigid, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. His name is Friedrich, and he is a soldier of the German Reich, a prisoner of war. He is surrounded on all sides by American families, mothers, children, elderly men, whose own sons, brothers, and husbands are at this very moment fighting and dying in Europe, fighting him. He can feel their sideways glances, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and perhaps something else he cannot yet name. He lowers his head, his face a mask of profound disbelief. Months ago, he was fighting in the ruins of France, taught that Americans were godless, decadent barbarians. Now he sits among them, in their house of God. How did this happen? How did a soldier of a regime that sought to bend faith to its will end up a guest in an American church pew? This is the story of an invitation that defied all logic of war, an act of faith that proved to be a more powerful weapon than any artillery shell, and one that would expose the deepest lie at the heart of the Third Reich. Before Friedrich ever set foot in Nebraska, his relationship with God was already a casualty of war and ideology. He had been born in northern Germany, near Bremen, into a family that was devoutly Lutheran. His childhood was marked by baptisms, Christmas services, and the ringing of the church bell every Sunday. But that world began to dissolve in 1933. The rise of National Socialism brought with it a profound and insidious assault on traditional faith. The Nazi Party, while claiming to support positive Christianity in its official platform, viewed the church as a rival for the soul of the German people. Loyalty to God could not supersede loyalty to the Führer. Friedrich was, like all boys of his generation, conscripted into the Hitler Youth. There, the message was clear. The old ways were weak. Christianity, with its tenets of mercy, humility, and love for one's enemy, was a Jewish invention, a slave morality designed to hold the strong Aryan race in bondage. His Hitler Youth leaders openly mocked the pastors of his childhood. They introduced new quasi-pagan rituals, solstice celebrations, and oaths of blood loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Faith was not to be placed in an unseen savior, but in the tangible destiny of the German Volk and its leader. This created a deep spiritual conflict. The state-sponsored Deutsche Christen, or German Christian movement, tried to merge Nazi ideology with Christianity, displaying swastikas alongside the cross and promoting a manly, militaristic Jesus. But brave theologians like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer formed the Bekennende Kirche, or Confessing Church, to resist this co-opting of their faith, a resistance that landed many of them in concentration camps. For a young man like Friedrich, the lines were blurred and dangerous. It was simply easier to push faith aside, to embrace the new, muscular ideology of the state. Then came the propaganda about the enemy. The vision of America painted by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine was one of utter moral and spiritual decay. It was a chaotic land of racial mongrels controlled by Jewish bankers, where gangsters roamed the streets, and the music, this degenerate jazz, was proof of their primitive, animalistic nature. Above all, it was portrayed as a nation without a soul, a place where capitalism was the only god and money the only prayer. Friedrich was taught that American soldiers were not crusaders, but mercenaries, fighting only for pay and pleasure, lacking the deep spiritual Heimat, or homeland, that supposedly gave the German soldier his strength. With this ideological armor, Friedrich was sent to war. He was assigned to an infantry division and tasted his first combat in the hedgerow hell of Normandy following the D-Day landings. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and terrifying. He saw men on both sides torn apart by machine guns and mortars. The abstract concepts of propaganda dissolved into the visceral, personal reality of survival. His unit was shattered during the massive Allied breakout, Operation Cobra. In the chaos, wounded by shrapnel and separated from his comrades, he was captured by an American patrol. The moment of capture was one of sheer terror. He expected a bullet, or at the very least a bayonet. Surrender, he had been taught, was a prelude to torture and execution. Instead, an American medic saw his wound, gave him a sulfa packet, and bound his arm, all before offering him a cigarette. This first simple act of professional decency was a profound shock. It was the first data point that did not fit the narrative. The journey to America was a surreal dream. He was transported on a massive Liberty ship, one of hundreds in a convoy so vast it seemed to cover the ocean. The first clue to the industrial might he had been told did not exist. He and his fellow prisoners were fed white bread, a luxury not seen in Germany for years. They drank real coffee. They were given medical treatment. Upon arriving at a massive processing center, they were deloused, given clean clothes, and then put on trains. These trains didn't have cattle cars, as they had used for their own prisoners, but cushioned seats. For days, he stared out the window at a country that was utterly untouched by war. There were no bombed-out cities, no shell craters, no burned-out tanks. He saw endless fields of grain, towering silos, towns with brightly lit shops, and roads choked with automobiles. He saw a people living in casual abundance, seemingly unaware of the global cataclysm. It was the land of plenty, and it was deeply, profoundly unsettling. His propaganda-fueled image of a decadent, collapsing society was crumbling hour by hour. Friedrich was assigned to Camp Atlanta, a major prisoner of war camp located near Holdridge, Nebraska. This was one of over 500 such camps that would eventually be built across the United States, housing nearly 400,000 German prisoners by the war's end. The camp itself was another source of cognitive dissonance. It was clean, organized, and operated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. In fact, the U.S. government often went beyond the minimum requirements. The prisoners were housed in barracks, given 3 meals a day, and had access to recreational facilities. There was a library, a theater where prisoners staged their own plays, and sports leagues. More importantly, Article 16 of the Geneva Convention explicitly guaranteed religious freedom for prisoners of war. The U.S. military, far from the godless entity he'd been warned of, actively facilitated this. Camp Atlanta, like many large camps, had its own chapel and a designated German-speaking chaplain, often a captured German military chaplain, who was allowed to hold regular Sunday services for both Protestant and Catholic prisoners. This was a startling revelation for Friedrich. He had not attended a proper church service in years. Hesitantly, he went and found himself singing the same Lutheran hymns he had known as a boy, surrounded by hundreds of his fellow Lanzer soldiers. The American camp authorities did not interfere. They supplied the hymnals, Bibles, and a small pump organ, all often coordinated through neutral agencies like the International YMCA. This official, systematic respect for his faith was a stark contrast to the state-sponsored suspicion and co-opting of the church he had experienced back home. But the camp chapel, while important, was still a world behind the wire, a community of fellow Germans. The most profound experience was yet to come, and the mechanism for it was, as in so many cases, the American labor shortage. By 1944, with over 16 million American men in uniform, the nation's farms were desperate for help. Nebraska, a crucial part of the nation's breadbasket, was facing a critical manpower crisis. The harvest would rot in the fields without laborers. The government's solution was the POW work program. Farmers could contract with the military for prisoner labor. They would be paid the local prevailing wage, from which the government would deduct the cost of the program, giving the prisoner 80 cents per day in camp scrip for his work, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention. In the fall of 1944, Friedrich, like thousands of others at Camp Atlanta, was put on a truck every morning and driven out to the surrounding farms to help harvest corn and sugar beets. This was his first real contact with American civilians. The local population in Nebraska was, at first, deeply mistrustful. The local newspapers, like the Holdridge Daily Citizen, ran articles reminding residents that these men were the enemy and that fraternization was forbidden. These were the same soldiers who were killing their sons and brothers in Europe. But the relentless, daily reality of shared labor began to erode this formal hostility. The prisoners were not goose-stepping fanatics, but exhausted young men, many from farm backgrounds themselves, who knew how to work and were grateful to be out of the camp. Friedrich was assigned to the farm of the Peterson family a few miles outside of town. The farmer, a man named Ben Peterson, was a second-generation Danish immigrant, stoic and hard-working. His wife, Esther, was a pillar of the local Lutheran church. Their only son was serving with the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. The first few weeks were silent and professional. Friedrich and two other POWs would work the fields, supervised by Ben and a single, often relaxed American guard. Ben was not cruel, but he was distant. Esther would bring out water and a midday meal which they ate under a tree, separate from the family. The food was simple but hearty: thick sandwiches, milk, and sometimes a piece of pie. It was far better than anything they received in camp and light years beyond what German civilians were eating. Friedrich worked hard, his farming roots showing in his efficiency. Ben Peterson, a man who respected hard work above all else, began to notice. He saw Friedrich's skill in mending a piece of broken machinery, his gentle hand with the draft horses. The conversation started slowly. Ben would ask about farming in Germany. Friedrich, in his improving English, would ask about the hybrid corn Ben was so proud of. One Saturday, after a grueling day of harvesting, Ben did something unexpected. He invited the prisoners to the porch for a cold beer. The guard, a local boy himself, didn't object. They sat in the cool evening air, drinking, and for the first time, Ben asked about their families. Friedrich spoke of his parents, his village, his Lutheran upbringing. Ben and Esther exchanged a look. They had not considered this. They saw a Nazi, an abstract enemy. They now saw Friedrich, a young Lutheran boy, just like the boys in their own community. The next day, Sunday, was their day of rest at the camp. But the following week, Esther approached him as he worked. "Friedrich," she said slowly, "this Sunday, we go to church at 10 o'clock. You come with us? To our church?" Friedrich was stunned into silence. He thought he must have misheard. An invitation to dinner was one thing, a shocking breach of protocol in itself. But an invitation to their church? To sit beside them, among their neighbors, in the middle of a war? It seemed impossible, dangerous even. He looked at Ben, who simply nodded. "You're welcome, son," he said, "if you'd like to come." Friedrich didn't know what to say, but he nodded. It was a gesture that would lead him to that pew, surrounded by singing Americans, grappling with a single, overwhelming question. Who were these people? To understand the depth of Friedrich's shock, one must understand what an American church in 1944 represented. It was not just a house of worship, it was the social and moral center of the community. It was where families were baptized, married, and mourned. It was where the town gathered to pray for its sons at war. Every family in that congregation had a stake in the conflict. The service flag near the altar, dotted with blue stars for those serving and increasingly gold stars for those who had fallen, was a raw, open wound. To bring an enemy soldier, a Kraut, into this sacred space was not just a social risk, it was an act of profound, almost radical moral courage on the part of the Peterson family. Ben and Esther had likely spent the week in quiet, anxious discussion. They would face the whispers, the cold stares, the accusations of being Hun lovers. And yet, they had done it anyway. As Friedrich sat in that pew, he felt the weight of those stares. He was acutely aware of his foreignness, his closely cropped hair, the very essence of his identity as the enemy. He half expected the pastor to stop the service and denounce him from the pulpit. The service itself was another layer of surrealism. The pastor, a stern-looking man, began his sermon. He spoke of the war. He prayed for victory for the Allied forces, for the safe return of the town's young men. He spoke of the evil that had plunged the world into darkness. Friedrich tensed, expecting a direct condemnation of himself and his people. But then the pastor's tone shifted. He began to speak of the gospel reading for the day, a passage about loving one's enemies, about leaving vengeance to God, about the duty of Christian charity even in the darkest of times. He spoke of the stranger in their midst and the test of faith it represented. Friedrich wasn't sure if the sermon was for him or because of him, but the message was unmistakable. It was a complex theological idea, a struggle between patriotism and a higher moral calling, and they were having this debate openly, in front of him. This, too, was unthinkable. In Germany, the church either towed the party line or it was silenced. This open grappling with morality, this willingness to see a gray area in the middle of a black and white war, was a sign of a freedom he hadn't known existed. After the service, the moment Friedrich had been dreading arrived. The final Amen was spoken, the organ played its recessional, and the congregation began to file out. He kept his head down, intending to follow the Petersons out as quickly and quietly as possible. He expected a wall of silence, cold shoulders, perhaps even hissed insults. But as they stepped into the bright Nebraska sunlight, an elderly woman with a kind, wrinkled face stopped Esther Peterson, her eyes flicking curiously to Friedrich. Esther simply said, "This is Friedrich. He's a good worker, helping Ben with the harvest." The woman looked at Friedrich, a long, searching look. Then she nodded slowly. "We pray for all the boys," she said, her voice quiet but firm, before moving on. One by one, others from the congregation noticed him. A few men, farmers themselves, nodded at Ben and then, by extension, at Friedrich. A group of women from the church auxiliary who were setting up tables for a potluck paused to watch. There were no shouts of anger, no patriotic denunciations. Instead, what he encountered was a shocking, unsettling civility. It was a complex and deeply American moment, a community processing this anomaly in real time, their curiosity and deeply ingrained sense of neighborliness and faith warring with their anger about the war. Ben, perhaps sensing Friedrich's discomfort and the tension in the air, clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, son," he said, steering him towards the church basement where the potluck was being set up. "These ladies put on the best spread in the county. You can't miss this." The thought of eating with the entire congregation was, if possible, even more terrifying than the service. But he followed, a captive satellite in the Petersons' orbit. The basement was a large, low-ceilinged room, buzzing with conversation and filled with the aromas of roasted chicken, baked beans, and Jell-O salads. The tables were groaning under the weight of food. Friedrich was handed a plate and stood in line, shuffling along with farmers, their wives, and their children. He was, again, acutely aware of his status, a prisoner, an enemy, partaking in this feast. He felt an intense wave of shame and unworthiness, thinking of the starvation rations his own people were enduring in the bombed-out cities of Germany. He saw firsthand what he had only glimpsed on the farm, an abundance so profound, so casual, that it could be given away in vast quantities at a church social. He sat at a long table with the Petersons. A few other farmers joined them. The conversation at first skirted around him, focusing on crop prices, the weather, and local news. But then, the pastor who had delivered the sermon sat down across from him. The pastor, a man named Reverend Johnson, looked at him kindly. "I am glad you joined us, Friedrich," he said, his voice measured. "I studied for a time in Germany, before the war, at Heidelberg, a beautiful country." Friedrich looked up, shocked. The pastor began to speak to him in halting, academic German. He asked about Friedrich's home, his family. He spoke of his own admiration for the theologian Karl Barth and his concern for the confessing church. Here was an American spiritual leader in the middle of a war discussing complex theology and expressing concern for the anti-Nazi elements within Germany. It was the complete opposite of the monolithic, hateful Amis, Americans, that Goebbels had painted. This pastor saw nuance. He saw a difference between a German and a Nazi, between the state and the individual. This conversation, more than anything else, began to dismantle the last pillars of Friedrich's indoctrination. This single event, the invitation to church, was a profound turning point. It unlocked a new, deeper layer of his relationship with the Petersons and the wider community. It was not a one-time occurrence. Friedrich was invited back, and as the weeks passed, the initial shock of the congregation faded, replaced by a cautious, quiet acceptance. He became Ben Peterson's German, a known, if unusual, fixture. This act by the Petersons was not without consequence. They endured whispers. Some neighbors, whose sons had been killed or wounded, could not understand it and kept their distance. But for Ben and Esther, it was a matter of deeply held conviction. Their faith was not just something they practiced for an hour on Sunday, it was something they lived. And in their eyes, Friedrich was no longer an abstract enemy, but a young man, a Lutheran boy, who was lost and far from home. They felt a Christian duty to offer him not just work and food, but spiritual solace as well. The impact on Friedrich was transformative. He began to see America not as a single, menacing entity, but as a collection of individuals, complex, moral, and, in his experience, astonishingly kind. This realization was happening in small pockets all across the nation. Friedrich's story, while remarkable, was not entirely unique. The historical records of POW camps are dotted with similar, incredible accounts of religious outreach. In many towns, local clergy were given regular access to the camps to provide spiritual care, often working alongside the official German-speaking military chaplains. In Iowa, at Camp Algona, German-speaking pastors from the local community would often hold services. What made Friedrich's case different was the personal invitation into the community itself. This was a far greater leap of faith for all involved. This outreach was often spearheaded by specific denominations. German-American communities, particularly those of Lutheran or Mennonite backgrounds, felt a complex duty. They were fiercely patriotic Americans, often sending their own sons to fight, yet they also felt a cultural and linguistic tie to the prisoners. They understood the language, the hymns, the specific traditions. They could see the German underneath the Nazi. At the large camp in Hearne, Texas, Catholic prisoners were visited by the local bishop. In Wisconsin, a state with a massive German-American population, the interactions were frequent. Prisoners were sometimes allowed to participate in local choir festivals, singing German carols at Christmas, a surreal and poignant moment for all involved. The U.S. government, for its part, saw this as a net positive. General B.M. Bryan of the Provost Marshal General's office recognized that religious services were a crucial tool for maintaining camp morale and discipline. But more than that, it was a key part of the burgeoning re-education program. The government understood that defeating the German army was only half the battle. Defeating the ideology was the real long-term victory. What better way to counter Nazi propaganda about godless America than to actively facilitate the prisoners' religious freedom? What better way to demonstrate the principles of democracy and individual liberty than to have prisoners experience it firsthand? Friedrich's experience at the Peterson farm became a living embodiment of this re-education. He saw democracy not as a political theory, but in the way the Petersons treated him. He saw it in the way Ben would argue politics with his neighbors at the feed store, a casual act of free speech that would have landed them in a concentration camp back home. He saw it in the local newspaper, which would sometimes print letters critical of President Roosevelt, an act of open dissent that was unthinkable in Germany. And he saw it in the church, where the pastor was free to interpret scripture and apply it as a moral guide, even when it was difficult and challenged the government's total war narrative. This was the true American strength he had been blind to. It wasn't just the endless supply of tanks and planes. It was the bedrock of ideas and freedoms that produced a society so confident, so abundant, and so morally assured that it could afford to be kind to its captured enemies. He continued to work on the farm through the winter and into the spring of 1945. The bond with the Petersons deepened. He was no longer just the German helper, he was, in an unspoken way, a temporary part of the family. He shared their anxieties as news of the Battle of the Bulge came through, a terrible, bloody setback. He felt a complex shame as the first reports and newsreels of the liberated concentration camps, Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, were shown in America. The camp authorities made sure the prisoners saw these images, and the reaction was one of profound shock and denial for many. But Friedrich, having lived with the Petersons, had a different context. He saw the horrified, sickened reaction of Ben and Esther, and he understood that the evil his nation had unleashed was something they, as decent, God-fearing people, could not even comprehend. It helped him process his own shame, to separate his identity as a German from the monstrous crimes of the Nazi regime. He saw that the Petersons' kindness was not a sign of weakness or naivety, it was the absolute core of their strength. When VE Day arrived in May 1945, the news was met with a complex mix of emotions. On the farm, there was profound relief. Esther cried, thanking God her son in the Pacific might now be safe. Ben shook Friedrich's hand, not as a victor to a vanquished foe, but as one man to another, acknowledging the end of a long shared ordeal. For Friedrich, it was a cocktail of relief that the killing was over, deep anxiety for his family's fate, and a profound sadness that his time in this strange, kind refuge was coming to an end. The work details continued for a time, as the harvest still needed to be brought in, but the atmosphere had changed. The war was over. They were no longer the enemy, but simply the vanquished, waiting to go home. The last Sunday he attended church with the Petersons, the service felt different. It was a service of thanksgiving, but also of mourning for the terrible cost. As the congregation sang the final hymn, Esther Peterson, who was standing next to Friedrich, quietly shared her hymnal with him. He sang the words in his own language, his voice joining the chorus of American farmers, his former enemies. It was the final, perfect symbol of an impossible journey, from a soldier of the Reich to a member of a Nebraska congregation, a transformation wrought not by force, but by a simple invitation. The impact of that first Sunday potluck was profound and immediate. When Friedrich returned to Camp Atlanta that evening, the smell of roasted chicken and coffee still clinging to his clothes, his fellow prisoners in the barracks were incredulous. They gathered around, their expressions a mix of envy and deep suspicion. He recounted the day in a low voice, the singing, the sermon that seemed to be about him, the pastor speaking German, the endless food. Many of them simply refused to believe it. It had to be a trick, a propaganda effort. "They are trying to soften you, Friedrich," one older sergeant warned, his face grim. "They are trying to make you a traitor." But Friedrich knew what he had experienced was not a staged government program. It was too personal, too authentic, too awkward. It was the uncoordinated, genuine act of a family and their community. The Petersons' invitation was not a one-time event. They made it clear he was welcome every Sunday, and soon, Friedrich's presence in the third-to-last pew became a normal part of the town's landscape. The initial stares of curiosity from the congregation softened into nods of recognition and eventually into quiet greetings. But this acceptance was not universal, and it came at a cost to the Petersons. Holdridge, Nebraska, like every town in America, was sacrificing for the war. The local paper, the Holdridge Daily Citizen, was filled with casualty lists from Europe and the Pacific. There were families in that very congregation who had received the dreaded telegram from the War Department. To them, seeing an enemy soldier, a young, healthy man in the prime of his life, being treated with kindness while their own sons were in muddy foxholes, or worse, already gone, was an unbearable insult. Ben and Esther faced quiet criticism. Old friends stopped talking to them at the post office. There were whispers of them being unpatriotic. One letter to the editor of The Citizen in late 1944, though not naming the Petersons directly, captured the sentiment of many. It was written by a local mother and read in part, "It is one thing to follow the rules of war for prisoners. It is another to forget who they are. They are the same men who are killing our boys. To see them treated as guests in our community is a slap in the face to every mother who prays for her son's return." This was the very real and painful friction point of the American home front. The kindness shown by families like the Petersons was not a universal, naive impulse. It was a conscious moral choice made in the face of significant social pressure and personal grief. This open public disagreement, the fact that the Holdridge Daily Citizen would print such a critical letter, was for Friedrich perhaps the most astounding lesson of all. In Germany, such a public critique of a neighbor's patriotic behavior or of a local policy would be unthinkable. It would lead to a visit from the Gestapo. Here it was simply part of the loud, messy, and open debate of a free society. The fact that the Petersons were not arrested, not censored, and not punished, but simply continued to live their convictions was a more powerful civics lesson than any pamphlet. Friedrich's presence at the church soon evolved from passive observer to active participant. One morning, the church organist was ill. The congregation sang the hymns a cappella, their voices hesitant. Esther Peterson, knowing Friedrich had spoken of music in his village, nudged him. "Friedrich," she whispered, "do you know how to play?" Friedrich, who had received classical piano lessons as a boy before the Hitler Youth consumed his time, admitted he could, a little. The next Sunday, after some quiet arrangement by Reverend Johnson, Friedrich found himself sitting at the small, aging pump organ. His fingers, calloused from farm work, felt clumsy on the keys. But as he began to play the familiar notes of "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," a hymn as central to Lutheranism in Germany as it was in Nebraska, a hush fell over the congregation. Here was this enemy soldier filling their church with their shared sacred music. It was a moment of profound and complex unity. From then on, he often played during the services, a German POW providing the soundtrack for an American congregation's worship. This type of religious outreach, while seemingly extraordinary, was actually part of a much larger, though often unheralded, national effort. The U.S. government, bound by Article 16 of the Geneva Convention to guarantee religious freedom, found an enormous and eager partner in America's religious organizations. The National YMCA, for instance, played a pivotal role. Through its War Prisoners Aid program and working with the International Red Cross, the YMCA was one of the few organizations allowed to operate on both sides of the conflict. In American POW camps, they distributed tens of thousands of Bibles, prayer books, and theological texts, many in German and Italian. They provided musical instruments, pump organs, guitars, accordions for camp chapels. They provided art supplies that POs used to create stunning nativity scenes and religious frescoes on their barracks walls. This was not just charity, it was a deliberate, large-scale operation to provide spiritual and intellectual resources based on the belief that a man's soul was not a casualty of war. The Catholic Church in America was similarly mobilized. The National Catholic War Council, or NCWC, took a special interest in the tens of thousands of Italian and German Catholic prisoners. They coordinated with American bishops to send priests, often German-speaking or Italian-speaking, into the camps to hear confession and celebrate Mass. They distributed over 750,000 rosaries, prayer books, and religious medals to prisoners. At Camp Hearn in Texas, one of the largest camps, visiting priests were a regular sight, holding services in a chapel built entirely by the prisoners themselves. For an Italian farmer, drafted into Mussolini's army and now finding himself in the middle of Texas, the ability to attend a familiar Latin Mass, to confess to a priest, was a lifeline of normality and spiritual solace. It was a powerful, tangible message that their captors, the enemy, shared their most fundamental faith. For German Lutherans like Friedrich, the outreach was even more specific. The Lutheran Church's Missouri Synod, which had deep German roots and many German-speaking pastors in the Midwest, saw a unique opportunity. These American pastors, fluent in both the language and the complex theology, became a spiritual secret weapon. They could go into the camps like Camp Atlanta and not just offer a simple prayer, but engage in deep theological discussions. They were perfectly equipped to dismantle the Nazi-backed positive Christianity that many prisoners had been taught. They could sit down with these young men and, using the common language of Martin Luther, explain how Nazi ideology, its worship of the state, its racial hatred, its pagan elements, was a fundamental betrayal of true Christian doctrine. This was not U.S. government propaganda. This was German-speaking Lutheran pastors arguing theology with fellow Lutherans. It was a form of re-education that was deeply personal, intellectually sound, and profoundly effective, and it was happening in hundreds of camps, from Nebraska to Wisconsin to Texas. So, when Ben and Esther Peterson invited Friedrich to their church, they were not just acting in a vacuum. They were the grassroots, personal-level expression of this massive, nationwide spiritual outreach. They were taking the formal, structured efforts of the YMCA and the Missouri Synod and adding the most powerful ingredient of all, personal invitation and family hospitality. They were bridging the gap between the official respect for religion shown by the camp authorities and the personal embrace of a community. Friedrich's experience was the culmination of all these forces. He was receiving the official support of the camp chaplain, the theological resources of the YMCA, and the pastoral care of a German-speaking American reverend. But it was the Petersons who broke the final barrier, who took him behind the wire of their own community and showed him that their faith was not just a set of rules, but a lived, breathing reality that extended even to an enemy. This integration had practical effects beyond music. Friedrich, with his newfound status as a community fixture, began to see the inner workings of American civil society. When the church roof needed shingling, he saw the men of the congregation, Ben, the pastor, the owner of the local feed store, the town banker, all show up on a Saturday in work clothes to do the job themselves. In Germany, such labor would be ordered by a party official or assigned to a guild. Here, it was voluntary, a shared sense of responsibility for their community. Friedrich and the other prisoners working with him were asked to help, not ordered, but asked. He found himself on a roof, hammering shingles alongside the town banker, sharing a joke. He was treated as a co-worker, not a slave. This concept of voluntary community association, of citizens independently organizing to solve a problem, the very thing described by Alexis de Tocqueville a century earlier, was a revelation. It was the living, functional opposite of the top-down authoritarian Führer principle that had governed his entire life. But Friedrich's weekly visits to the Peterson farm in the Lutheran church, this open embrace of an American family, did not go unnoticed back at Camp Atlanta. A prisoner of war camp is not a homogeneous entity. It is a microcosm of the nation it represents, with all its political factions, hierarchies, and fears. The barracks at night were not just places of rest, but hotbeds of rumor, political debate, and sometimes dangerous enforcement. While many prisoners, like Friedrich, were weary of the war and simply grateful for their safety and humane treatment, a significant faction remained: the true believers. These were ardent Nazis, often young SS men or party loyalists, who viewed the war's disastrous turn as a temporary setback, and any German soldier who fraternized with the enemy as a Verräter, a traitor. This internal Camp Gestapo, as some prisoners called it, was a very real and dangerous element in many U.S. POW camps. In camps across the country, these fanatics enforced a brutal, secret discipline. They would hold kangaroo courts at night, accusing fellow prisoners of being too American or of betraying the fatherland. The punishments could be severe: beatings, shunning, and in a few documented cases, even murder. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a prisoner named Hugo Kraus was found hanged, a suspected suicide that was widely believed to be an execution by Nazi enforcers for his anti-Nazi sentiments. At Camp Hewlin, another Texas camp, prisoners who showed interest in American re-education programs were viciously beaten. Even at Camp Algona in Iowa, there were reports of ideological intimidation. For Friedrich to openly leave the camp, not just to work, but to participate in an American family's social and religious life, was an act of quiet but profound defiance, not just against the rules of war, but against the hidden, violent power structure of his own barracks. He was, in effect, risking his life twice, once by being a German in America, and again by being an American lover among Germans. The other prisoners on his work detail were nervous. Friedrich, one of them, warned him quietly as they rode back on the truck, "Be careful what you say in the barracks. The men from Barrack 4, they are watching. They say you are being converted." Friedrich felt a cold knot of fear. But what could he do? Deny the kindness he had seen? Pretend the Petersons were the monsters he had been told they were? The truth of his experience was too powerful. The decency of Ben and Esther, the simple humanity of the church potluck, had become a shield. He chose to say nothing, to quietly continue his work and his weekly visits, a decision that took a different kind of courage than facing artillery on the battlefield. The U.S. Army was not ignorant of this internal Nazi terror. The Provost Marshal General's office, responsible for the POW program, was deeply concerned. These internal murders and beatings were a security nightmare, but they also highlighted a strategic problem. If all these prisoners were simply repatriated at the end of the war, still filled with fanatical Nazi ideology, what was to stop them from starting another war in 20 years? This realization led to one of the most secret and ambitious programs of the war, a formal intellectual re-education effort designed to, as the program's director stated, win the war for German minds. The Army began a massive secret project to identify and segregate the prisoners. They screened the entire POW population, quietly labeling them white, anti-Nazi, cooperative, gray, apolitical, opportunist, or black, ardent, fanatical Nazi. The black prisoners, the enforcers and diehards, were quietly removed from the general population and consolidated in special high-security camps like Camp Alva in Oklahoma. This was done to break their hold on the rest of the prison population. Conversely, the white prisoners, Men like Friedrich, who had demonstrated a willingness to cooperate or an anti-Nazi leaning, were also segregated into their own camps, like Camp Wetherill in Rhode Island or Camp Ruston, Louisiana. In these special democracy schools, a massive intellectual effort was undertaken. The U.S. brought in German-American university professors, exiled German writers, and even former prisoners who had been turned to teach courses on American government, literature, and history. They published a special German-language POW newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, which was filled with articles extolling the virtues of democracy and reporting the truth about the war and the Nazi regime. They screened American films, not just propaganda, but films by directors like Frank Capra that celebrated the common man. What is so remarkable is that Friedrich was receiving this exact re-education, not in a formal classroom, but in the real world. The Petersons, Reverend Johnson, and the entire town of Holdridge had, without knowing it, become his democracy school. He didn't just read about a free press in Der Ruf, he saw Ben Miller read a critical letter in the Holdridge Daily Citizen and then go about his day. He didn't just hear a lecture on religious freedom, he sat on a church roof hammering shingles next to the town banker, a living example of voluntary association. He wasn't just told that Americans were decent, moral people, he was shown it, day after day, by a family who had every reason to hate him but chose compassion instead. This personal, lived experience was infinitely more powerful than any government-led program. The Petersons were succeeding in the war for German minds on a scale of 1, and in doing so, were validating the entire premise of the American re-education effort. This deep psychological shift was made even more complex by the news arriving from Germany. While Friedrich was experiencing this extraordinary kindness, his own country was being systematically, brutally, and justly pounded into submission. Letters from his family, when they arrived, were heavily censored by both German and American authorities, but the fragments of news he could glean were terrifying. He would read a letter from his mother written in guarded language about visiting relatives in the country, a euphemism for being bombed out of their home, or food being scarce, a euphemism for near starvation. He would sit in the Petersons' warm kitchen, his stomach full of beef stew, and read about his family surviving on turnips and bread rations that were a fraction of what he, the prisoner, received. The guilt was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He saw the newsreels at the camp, which the Americans made available per the Geneva Convention. He saw the footage of Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden, cities he knew, reduced to apocalyptic landscapes of rubble. He saw the 1,000 bomber raids and knew that his family, his friends, his entire nation was cowering under this avalanche of fire. And this, too, was an American act. The nation that showed him such personal kindness in the form of Esther Peterson was the same nation that was dropping thousands of tons of explosives on his homeland. This paradox was the central, agonizing dilemma for prisoners like Friedrich. How could he reconcile the two? How could a nation be both so compassionate and so utterly ruthless? It was in church, sitting beside Ben Peterson, that he began to find an answer. He saw in Ben a man who was deeply moral, who prayed for his enemies, but who also bought war bonds and believed with an iron certainty that the war his sons were fighting was a just and necessary one. He was witnessing a culture that, unlike his own, was comfortable with this duality, the ability to show personal mercy to a captive while waging total, impersonal war against the ideology that captive represented. This complex bond was cemented during Christmas of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was at its most desperate phase. American casualties were mounting. The news was grim. It was a dark and anxious time for the Miller family, with their sons in harm's way. Friedrich fully expected to be told to remain at the camp for the holiday. It would be unthinkably unpatriotic to host an enemy soldier for Christmas, especially now. But on Christmas Eve, Ben Peterson showed up at the camp's work gate, just as he always did. The invitation was simple. Martha's made a special dinner. We want you there. The atmosphere in the farmhouse that night was thick with a strange, poignant emotion. The small Christmas tree was lit, but the blue star in the window, signifying a son at war, seemed to glow with a more anxious light. They ate a quiet dinner, the radio playing softly, reporting news from the Ardennes that made Friedrich's stomach clench. After the meal, they gathered in the living room. Sarah, the daughter, sat at the piano. She began to play a familiar, simple melody, Stille Nacht, Silent Night. a German carol beloved by the entire world. Sarah began to sing in English, "Silent Night, Holy Night." After a moment, Esther, her voice soft, joined in. Then Ben, his deep voice hesitant. Friedrich sat frozen, the music transporting him back to his childhood, to a dozen other Christmas Eves in his village church. Esther looked at him. "You know it, don't you, Friedrich?" He nodded, his throat thick. "In German," she whispered. "Sing it for us, in German." And so, in a small Iowa farmhouse in the middle of the most brutal war in history, while his countrymen and his host's sons were killing each other in a frozen forest, Friedrich began to sing. "Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht." His voice, at first trembling, grew stronger. He sang the words of his childhood, and the Petersons listened, their eyes filled with a shared, profound sadness and a strange, unshakable peace. When he finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Esther handed him a small, clumsily wrapped package. Inside was a pair of thick wool socks she had knitted herself. A simple gift, a mother's gift. It was, Friedrich would later write, the moment he truly understood. The war was lost, his ideology was a lie, and the only thing that mattered was the simple, human connection he had found in that room. That Christmas, that shared hymn was the emotional climax of Friedrich's time in America. As 1945 progressed, the inevitable end drew near. The news of Germany's final unconditional surrender in May was met at Camp Atlanta with a profound, complex silence. It was not the joy of victory, nor the sharp sting of defeat, but a numb acknowledgement that the largest ordeal in human history was finally over. For Friedrich, it was a moment of deep anxiety. His nation was in ruins, his family's fate unknown, and his own future as a prisoner was uncertain. The farm work details, which had been his lifeline to the outside world, were gradually phased out. His final day at the Peterson farm was heavy with unspoken words. He thanked Ben and Esther for their inconceivable kindness. Martha pressed a small box of home-baked cookies into his hand, for the journey, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. Ben, ever the stoic farmer, simply shook Friedrich's hand, a firm, long grip that communicated more than any speech could. "You write to us, Friedrich," Ben said, his voice thick. "You let us know you are home and safe." The journey back was the reverse of his arrival, but in a world shattered. He was one of nearly 400,000 German prisoners shipped back to a Europe that no longer resembled the one they had left. He was processed first in France, where he and other prisoners were often used for labor, clearing rubble and rebuilding roads under far harsher conditions than they had ever experienced in America. The contrast was stark. In America, he was a guest in a church. In France, he was a reviled member of a defeated army. He finally arrived back in his home village near Bremen in 1946, a gaunt man in a worn-out coat walking into a landscape of ghosts. His family home was damaged but standing. His parents, aged a decade in a few short years, wept when they saw him, believing him long dead. He found a nation psychologically and physically destroyed, grappling with the monstrous guilt of the Holocaust and facing a daily struggle for basic survival. In the lean, desperate years of post-war Germany, amidst the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, clearing the cities by hand, the memory of Nebraska seemed like an impossible dream. He would tell his family about the farm, about the endless food, about the kindness of the Petersons. They listened, but it was hard for them to comprehend. How could they, while boiling turnips for their only meal, understand a place where enemies were invited to a church potluck? But Friedrich never forgot. As soon as the fragile post-war mail system was re-established, he wrote his first letter. It was a simple, heartfelt note addressed to Ben Peterson, farmer, near Holdridge, Nebraska, USA. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle cast across a broken world. Months passed, and he heard nothing. He assumed the letter was lost, or that the Petersons, with the war over and their son's home, had forgotten him. Then, one day in 1947, a package arrived. It was from America. It was from the Peterson family. Inside were not just letters, but tinned meat, coffee, sugar, and thick wool socks, luxuries more valuable than gold in starving post-war Germany. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The Petersons, hearing of the hardships, had organized a care package drive at their church, the very church Friedrich had attended. They sent aid not just to him, but to his entire village. This act cemented the bond for life. The correspondence continued, no longer between captor and captive, but between friends. Friedrich sent them photos as he rebuilt his life, as he married, as he had children of his own. The Petersons sent news of their farm, of their son's safe return from the Pacific, of their grandchildren. The simple invitation to church in 1944 had blossomed into a lifelong transnational friendship, a personal Marshall Plan of kindness. The story of Friedrich and the Petersons is a profound testament to an often overlooked aspect of the American character. While the nation waged a total, ruthless, and necessary war against a monstrous ideology, its people, on an individual level, often refused to surrender their own humanity. The religious outreach to prisoners of war was not a minor footnote. It was a massive, deliberate effort. Historians like Matthias Reis, in his work God for Us, have documented the extensive spiritual programs within the camps. But the true, lasting impact was made by the individual families, the Petersons of Nebraska, the Millers of Iowa, who took the abstract concept of religious freedom and turned it into a tangible, life-changing act of religious welcome. They risked the scorn of their neighbors, not out of naive idealism, but out of a deep-seated conviction that their faith demanded it. What Friedrich and others like him experienced was the living contradiction of Nazi propaganda. He was taught he was fighting a godless, degenerate nation, only to find himself embraced by a community whose actions were so profoundly shaped by their faith that they extended grace even to their enemy. He saw a society that was strong enough to be compassionate, confident enough to debate its own morals in public, and free enough to allow a prisoner of war to play the organ in their church. This was the re-education that truly mattered, a lesson in democracy and humanity delivered not by a government pamphlet but by a church potluck and a shared hymnal. The legacy of these invitations echoes to this day, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of conflict, the most powerful and revolutionary act can be a simple gesture of shared faith, an invitation that says, "You are an enemy, but you are also a man, and you are welcome here."